Whether it's flood or fires, they've become a familiar sight when disaster strikes. And amid anger over their delayed deployment, the ADF's presence is set to ramp up all along the East Coast flood zones.
Over the next couple of days, we will build up to 6,000 nationally, spread between our operations in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales.
After copping it in Lismore yesterday, the PM arrived in Brisbane armed with what he hoped would be a crowd-pleasing announcement.
The biggest increase in the size of our defence forces in peacetime in Australian history.
18,500 personnel over 18 years.
Which will take our defence forces to 80,000 in number.
That boost is a response to the deteriorating global security situation. Russia and China, in other words.
If we don't provide a deterrence effect and work closely with our colleagues and with our allies, then they don't understand the lessons of history.
Despite the PM's surprise recruitment drive, there's little appetite to expand Defence's responsibility for national disasters.
But be clear, the Australian Defence Force are not the emergency responders. We are there to support the state governments in times of crisis.
But even the PM admits the odds of this all happening again are increasing.
Do you now consider climate disasters a national security issue?
Well, I think that I've said as much in the past. We are dealing with a different climate to the one we were dealing with before. I think that's just an obvious fact. And Australia is getting hard to live in.
And we know it's only going to get worse.
It definitely came up quicker than last year and further.
We keep seeing these flooding events occurring.
And this is not a 1 in 100 year flood.
If this doesn't show that the climate is changing, nothing will.
So if we're not throwing troops at the problem, what are we doing?
Admiral Chris Barrie is a former head of the Defence Force and a member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. Admiral, the PM made it clear today, troops are only part of the response to natural disasters. Do you agree?
Well, I agree with that statement as it stands, but what he omitted to talk about were the other parts of the response mechanisms, and that includes him and his government. So I find it always interesting that here we go again, the Prime Minister and the political leadership at the top of this country missing in action.
So with that in mind, Admiral, what do you think our response to natural disasters should be?
The first point I'd like to make is, we're about 15 years too late in trying to deal with the infrastructure changes that we need to put aside the old legacy systems and build adequate infrastructure to deal with a new future that looks like intense and more frequent extreme weather events. Our infrastructure systems aren't up to it. Our stormwater drains, our drainage systems, even at my home in Sydney, aren't adequate to get rid of tropical downpours that come in a very short space of time. And so where does the water go? Well, on the top of my flat roof in Sydney, it creates a swimming pool. And the small downpipes that we've got fitted just don't work. They've got to be bigger. And anyone who's grown up in the tropics knows that the gutters in the tropics are very big. When did you go to Singapore last? You have to jump over the gutter to get to the roadway because those gutters are constructed to move a whole lot of water real quick. And that's one of the reasons these floods have been such a disaster.
And yet, your point about infrastructure is well made, but as we just saw in this argument that broke out today between the Prime Minister and the Premier of Queensland, we end up in this debate about whose responsibility it is to think of the infrastructure, to fund the infrastructure, to build the infrastructure. Do you see a way through that argument that just comes up every single time?
Of course it does. And in the Security Leaders Climate Group, what we say is, step number one, let's have a frank climate risk assessment and figure it out. What is it we've really got to try and deal with here? And then secondly, we have to engage at all levels of our society. So we start in communities and then we go to local government levels. I know that in noughties, most local government administrations in Australia had climate adaptation plans. But I'll bet my bottom dollar they haven't been looked at since they were put in the drawer. And then we need to go to the state levels. In those days in the noughties, every time a shire or a municipality or a council went to the state government and said, what are we going to do about infrastructure that's going to be under 1 metre of sea level? And state governments in those days said, nothing, not interested. Now, that can't go on. So we have to engage. And it's at the federal level that we really do have to put an emphasis on this leadership issue. How can it be that the chief executive of Woolworths has been up there for the last 4 days looking after stores, looking after his people and trying to do the best he can to provide food for people on shelves and to provide food where they need it. And yet, you know, it's taken so long for our politicians to get there.
One noticeable difference this time around has been the government's willingness to at least acknowledge climate change as a factor. Does that give you some hope that we, might start to see more action on that front in the future?
I heard Scott Morrison say I'm on the record as saying climate change, this, that and the other. Well, first of all, I'd like to see the record because I haven't seen it. I can tell you that he wrote to our group in June of last year and he promised us there'd be a real action plan going into Glasgow for COP26. We all know that plan was a nonsense. And frankly, here we go yet again. So whether it's bushfires or the pandemic or the floods and a succession of floods, they're still missing in action. This takes very strong and positive leadership to make sure that we all know what parts we've got to play in the plan and how things are going to unfold in the future by the setting of priority and the allocation of resources.
Admiral, there's a lot to think about. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Great. Thank you.